Weapons and war. We see ships the way Vikings built them, that's to say ships with shallow hulls propelled using oars and that have a sail that can be raised on the high seas. We also see weapons that were inherited from the Vikings, which are also shown on the tapestry. They are long axes, a Danish tradition, which are handled by the Anglo-Saxons as seen on the Bayeux tapestry. Loot and booty were the driving force behind the Viking raids. For nearly 300 years war was a way of life for these predators of the north who left their mark across Europe. From the farthest steppes of Russia to the northernmost tip of the British Isles, they came out of nowhere to plunder and murder. From the shores of Scotland to the Caspian Sea, modern archaeology and science reveal for the first time the real driving forces behind the Viking raids from the Russian plains to the North Atlantic, while Viking enthusiasts of today live the life of the Scandinavian warriors and fight set-piece battles at the festival of Poland. Scientists and archaeologists from all over Europe are making groundbreaking discoveries. Recent research shows the Vikings from a new perspective and in the brutal social context of their time, spotlighting their incredible ability to plan and execute their expeditions for maximum profit and psychological effect. At the time when the Vikings attacked, there was starvation in England. There were dragons in the sky. When the Vikings came, it was like a part of the punishment from God. They'd been pushed into the top of a ditch, and they'd been very seriously traumatized at death there. Their bodies were very hacked about, legs, arms missing, the vertebral, second vertebral body indicates some decapitation marks. As you see, there's a clean cut through a cervical spine. To hear the story of the Vikings takes us to Sima Island in Estonia. Here a team of archaeologists from Tallinn excavated an amazing cache of Viking artifacts that turned the history of these Scandinavian pirates on its head. Uri Pits excavated one of the most impressive Viking burial sites known to experts today. The remains of more than 40 human skeletons in 2 boat graves were unearthed in 2011 during road construction. We can say for sure that it was a battle grave and that there was a sort of big battle. I mean 40 bodies in 2 ships, that says it all. The battle had to be hard. We can see vicious wounds on the skeletons. Some, for example, have hacked hands and broken skulls, so it was hard and they had to bury those victims fast. Tallinn researcher Riley Alma is studying bones of the Samar warriors and how they died. The skeletons all showed signs of violence, deaths and multiple battle wounds. The upper arm has cut into 4 pieces. There are more than 4 cuts into the bone. The hand position or upper arm position could have been some like that because some of the strokes are in the same direction, in the same angle, and then the position has changed. When the team from Tallinn applied modern dating techniques to the SK, they were shocked by what they music found. Analysis of the items we found, including the skeletons and the organic material, shows they go back to previous Viking music times. Incredibly, the ships and the bodies date back to at least 100 years before the first recorded Viking raid, yet the weapons, the shape of the ship and artifacts buried with them prove that the men found in the 2 boat graves came from Scandinavia. These 40 bodies show that Vikings were raiding at least a century earlier than scholars previously believed. We can be sure that these men were Scandinavian sailors who somehow met their death at Sal. As we shall see, the Viking Age was one of incredible brutality, and the ferocious battle that raged on the beach of Saaremaa must have been major if 40 warriors were hacked to pieces and then respectfully buried by their comrades. I think that during battle he fell down. He was attacked from behind, and maybe he fall down. He was fighting, probably because the cuts are in his right upper arm. But in my opinion, this upper arm, the hand was somehow fixed, because you cannot make the strokes like this, that they are in the same angle more or less. And finally I found this Gannis one of the bones in the foot I show you, which also means that he should have been lying or something, because the heat is somewhere here. And of course the final has been this decapitation. In my opinion, archaeological evidence in Russia confirms that Vikings raided but also traded along the great rivers of Eastern Europe at least as early as the mid-8th century. Adrian Saline is a researcher in early Russian history at St. Petersburg University, Russia. No one knew what was in ancient Russia. Everyone knew that somewhere around the Caspian Sea they were minting silver coins and that they could be exported to the rest of Europe in unimaginable quantities, and it was area between the Baltic and the Caspian Seas along the Volga River that was the first to be colonized by Scandinavians. Here at Staria Ladaga on the shores of the Valav River, tree ring dating of wooden objects such as this stick carved with letters of the Viking alphabet called runes shows that Scandinavian traders and warriors appeared here long before any mention of Vikings in the written chronicles. With regards to Sta, we can see that Scandinavian artifacts dating back to before the Viking Age have been found in the oldest of all the sites in the area of Styria, the ancient chronicles known as sagas and runic inscriptions in Scandinavia have given a name to these men whose exploits went unrecorded for centuries before they slashed their way into the history books. They were the Vikings. They were men and women who left the safety of their homes to explore and plunder distant lands from modern-day Poland, Ukraine, and Russia to the islands of the North Atlantic, and as far as America. The Vikings spread not only terror but also a web of trade. The mystery of where the Vikings came from and why they attacked has now been revealed. Scandinavian warriors had begun plundering coastlines of the Baltic Sea and Atlantic Ocean early in the 7th century. By the end of the 8th century they had occupied the northernmost of the British Isles, plundered Scotland, and dispossessed the indigenous population. The PS whose monuments still stand on Orne today. Well, I'm sure initially people came here trading, and that would have been the first contact, and the first contact would certainly have been on that level, and they would have been finding out what it was like in Shetland as a result of that, however. And you get objects appearing in the Pictish context showing that kind of link. The degree to which it did or didn't become aggressive we don't really know. Here at Iho on Shetland, the way the Vikings reused Pictish dwellings is clearly visible. What happened to the locals remains a mystery. Sometime in the 8th century warriors from Norway came here and the Pictish culture disappeared. The term Viking really only applies to the very first settlers who came, who were in that initial, exploratory, possibly raiding phase, which maybe in Shetland perhaps only lasted as much as a generation. I don't think it's as black and WH as either you were a raider and a pirate, or you were a farmer, and had your own industry, or soapstone industry, or whatever it was that you did. I'm sure that all these roles were mixed up together, and it's not clear-cut. The Vikings probably used Hatandran tactics to raid coastal and riverside communities in Scotland and Ireland for decades before they attacked a monastery in northern England where they found more gold than they could imagine. But they did not come for plunder alone. A titanic struggle was underway, pitting the Christian empire of Charlemagne against the last pagans of Europe. The holy island of Lindisfarne is cut off from land during high tides today. Tourists flock here for the seabirds. Monks first came here because it was isolated in the distance. The Northumbrian castle of Bamburgh was close enough for the holy men to exert religious influence and receive protection. No one expected the vicious attack of the 8th of June 793. Chronicler Alcuin of York commented, "Behold, the church of Street Cuspit spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments. A place more venerable than all in Britain is given as a prey to pagan peoples." Alcuin of York, however, was far away in Ain, the capital city of the greatest empire of Europe, ruled by Charlemagne, champion of the Christians. Charlemagne's drive northwards and the 30-year-long forcible conversion of the Saxons to Christianity brought his empire to the very edges of pagan Denmark. Inevitably, Christian chroniclers were the sworn enemies of the pagan Vikings, but according to Marit Via, the lead archaeologist at the royal palace at Orad Nes, Norway, the pagans may have been reacting to Christian atrocities at that time. Charlemagne was conquering territory after territory in Europe, and Charlemagne's war. While his culture minister was Alcuin, he had been to Lindisfarne Monastery. For instance, the first attack known to us was at Lindisfarne Monastery, so one theory is that the raid was a response to Charlemagne's aggression. We shall see that Viking raids became invasions when politics in Scandinavia and in the great kingdoms of Europe created opportunities for attack. The raids were planned to strike when the enemy was weakest and the potential for plunder. The greatest Shalaman died in 815 AD, and 30 years later his grandsons began a civil war that set 3 Frankish armies against each other. The opportunity to attack and pillage into the heart of the empire was too great to be missed. The great river S flows into the English Channel and leads all the way to Paris. In 841, Danish Viking Askar sailed up it with 13 ships, less than 1,000 men, and burned down the city of Rouen. He went on up the river to the magnificent monastery of Zier, where he ransomed the monks. The Vikings stayed for the winter and ravaged the countryside the next year too. In 845, the city of Paris itself was looted by a certain Ragnar. The Viking raids continued for the next 30 years. The Vikings avoided facing the Franks in battle, but more often they were paid either to leave or to fight each other or serve as mercenaries. They were also given land in the northern Netherlands and in the Ree Estuary in exchange for their military services. We can't ignore the shock and the violence, but nor can we see the relations between the Scandinavians and the Franks and other peoples as only this. There were also other types of relationship, including trade relations, as well as other relations such as discussions, negotiations, music, exchanges. When they found resistance in France, the Vikings turned to England, which was little more than a patchwork of weak kingdoms. Bamburgh was the seat of one of the Northumbrian kings, and Northumbria was just one of 4 kingdoms in England at the time. Northumbria stretched from the Scottish border to the Humber River just south of York. It was divided into 2 subkingdoms, constantly at war with each other, while the middle of England was occupied by Mercia. The kingdoms of East Anglia and Wessex occupied the east and west of the country. Divided and mutually hostile, they were unable to put up resistance to what initially was little more than a Viking nuisance. The part-time warriors of the English kingdoms were no match for the determined Viking music predators. In 865, the 4 leaders of the great heathen army Iva, Hallan, Alba, and Guam landed in East Anglia and began a 20-year reign of terror. They captured York on All Saints' Day when both rival kings of Northumbria were celebrating the Christian festivity. They practiced the blood eagle torture on one of the kings after killing the other in battle, and marched on to conquer the rest of England. York became a Viking capital for a century, but what the history books tell us isn't always backed up by archaeology, says Peter Connolly, the director of the excavations in the Hungate quarter of the city. We talk about the archaeology of York as being Anglo-Scandinavian, so you have the Anglo-Saxon aspect, and that Scandinavian aspect, and it's very difficult to tease those apart, so it already looks like we're dealing with a more cosmopolitan population than, say, the historical records would lead us to believe. The Yick Center at Coppergate in York holds significant artifacts of Scandinavian origin, such combs, which were a typical male adornment, but also this Saxon helmet was found in a well, while these boards from a Saxon ship were found as walls in a Viking storehouse in the Hungate area. After terrorizing the rest of northern England, Iva captured Ripon, an important religious and political centre in Maria. This pond at the back of Repton School and below the Chuckhard is what is left of the Tye River dock at the Viking fortress. Here in the churchyard, 250 skeletons, mostly male, were found gathered around a central grave dated to 873 by a Saxon coin. It was the year Iva died. Nearby at Heathwood, hundreds of small tumuli suggest that this was the Viking military cemetery. In the same year, one of the other Viking leaders, Hallan, raided into Scotland, but left some of his warriors to build farms. The Vikings were here to stay, but despite what the Christian chroniclers wrote, the impact on the tiny population of England was relatively imperceptible. We're not talking a massive population, hundreds of thousands, say further the north of England into Scotland, but I'd be very surprised if anybody estimated upwards of 1 million. Alfred, King of Wessex, the only Saxon kingdom to survive the Scandinavian onslaught, defeated a second invading Viking army at Ashdown, but the campaigns continued for nearly 20 years, with the Vikings drawing on help from Ireland, where Iva's sons had settled. The great heathen army campaigned tirelessly and almost successfully until the last surviving leader, Gam, was defeated by Alfred in 878 and signed a pact to be baptized. The vast area of England that came to be known as Danelaw would be ruled by Vikings in York. The peace did not last, however, as Viking bands from France and Ireland also joined in the fray in the following years, as we shall see. Event in Norway and Denmark continued to influence the patterns of raiding. Alfred's military reforms left Wessex better equipped to fight the raiders. He instituted the first standing army in England and a series of fortress towns known as burhs, where the rural population could seek refuge when under attack. England's renewed administrative efficiency assured the loyalty of the local population. The many sort of glances across to Anglo-Saxon England is because of its well-advanced taxation system. And there are ways of levering people out of the land, and that obviously comes with the fact that you get this trickle-down effect from the central power. Call it king to the way that land is given out, that benefaction and buys loyalty. Scotland too continued to be subject to attacks by Viking bands. In 871, Iva joined a Viking army from Ireland to capture Dumbarton Castle, an isolated British settlement in the heart of Scotland. The population was enslaved and sent to Ireland on the east coast of Scotland. The Vikings attacked Danada Castle too, just over the border with Northumbria, in the year 900, when the Pictish king Domnall was killed. Although the great heathen army had disappeared, the raids by other leaders, especially from Scotland and Ireland, continued, creating new states. such as the new kingdom of Strathclyde, famous for its stone carving school in Denmark and Norway. The territorial expansion of new ruling dynasties pushed nobles who refused to be subdued to seek their fortunes abroad. The richer the plunder, the more they invested in ships and men to mount ever larger attacks. Each Norwegian valley had its own king until the ruler of this strategic strait along Norway's coastline used his financial power to subdue those laws. In 870 Harold Fair began building the first kingdom of Norway from here at Ol Nes on Camo Island. What is certain is that all of Harold Fair's royal estates were located in Rogaland and Halland, and even though all other places were ruled on Harald Fair's behalf, he himself only had the full control in these two counties. What was happening in the Viking heartland affected the extent of the Viking raids in the east and west. The Viking onslaught against England and the Frankish lands was driven by politics as well as by lust for plunder. Opponents to Harold, those who saw no profit in paying tribute to him and serving as soldiers in his army, may have taken to raiding and exploring the North Atlantic instead. The hundreds of fjords were perfect places to hide, and plundering the rich coastlines of England and the Frankish Empire or sailing to Iceland must have seemed more attractive than serving. This upstart Danish chieftains served as mercenaries for the warring Frankish kings and were invited to occupy Frisia, opening the way to attacks further down the continental coastline. They brought home not only plunder but also ambitions to rule as kings in their own homelands. In 947 politics in Norway led to strife in England. Defeated by his English-educated brother Harold Fair's son Eric Blx found refuge among the Scandinavians of York. The nobles of North Frisia rebelled against their new Saxon king Edredin, and elected Eric king in his place at Rip Pen Cathedral. Edred reacted mercilessly, and ordered the cathedral burned, terrifying the rebellious nobles into surrender. The Norwegian Viking was killed in battle after a second attempt to gain the throne. So if we think about Eric Blx, he is disposed of the king of the area in 954 and it's around about 960 into the 970s that we see a whole new suite of development in Hungate. The area Hungate is in Jorvik now. It really is expanding past it, and that then continues right through into the 11th century. We have to bear in mind how Scandinavian societies developed. They themselves were the result of interaction with outside societies, but this too is subject to debate because we can't imagine that all the stimulus for evolution comes from outside, as has been said, but there were developments within Scandinavian society too. Swedish raiders dominated the Baltic Sea from Lake Mälaren and the islands of Gotland and Öland. These two large islands with their vast coastlines were perfect bases for raiders into Central and Eastern Europe, and a halfway house for the markets of Hiab and Birka. The market towns filled with goods plundered from the plains of Eastern Europe and stolen from the cities of the West. A large number of treasures found on the islands of Öland and Gotland, now on exhibition in the Stockholm Museum, show how profitable trade and plunder was, and how even from the earliest times the Vikings sought the most transported wealth available at the time. Bronze, silver, and gold they sold or stole. Furs were ivory, amber, and slaves. The Vikings had been raiding and trading along the rivers of Central and Eastern Europe for centuries before their first raid was recorded in the West. As far as I know today, the widespread belief is that the appearance of the Vikings in Eastern Europe is linked to their interest in silver that goes back to the 9th century, between the 800s and 900s. So in the 9th century, several million silver dirhams were exported from the Caspian Sea area. There were no distinctions between raiders and traders. One day they were plundering farmsteads and churches, the next selling those same goods at markets. One such trader was a certain Norwegian seafarer Orthera, who disclosed to King Alred of England what the trade routes of the Viking explorers and warriors where he described a trip to the very north of Norway and round into the Arctic Sea and down again in search of wares, tusks, and skins. He described the market town of Tsing in Norway and the trade routes into the Baltic Sea. Another explorer, Wulstan of Hab, reported where the Vikings exchanged their goods for such wealth. The travels of Wulstan proved the extent of the Viking web of trade between west and east. Among the places Wulfan visited was the great city of Trusso, whose remains Marinsky found 20 years ago while riding his bike home. As I said, Trusso was set up by the Scandinavian newcomers on the frontier with Baltic peoples and slaves. The objects which we found in Trusso are mainly Scandinavian, but we have ceramics, I mean clay pots, from Western slaves, and also pots made by Baltic people, I mean Krus people. The Viking warlords dominated this Baltic trading place, turning it into a military base to supply traders and warriors on their expeditions deep into Eastern and Southern Europe. Alongside articles of daily use, Marek Jagodinski found a large quantity of swords. Trussell was a hub of the Viking web of trade and pillage. In my opinion, we see a sort of globalization. We find the same crafts, the same Arab coins, the same weights everywhere from Britain to North Russia, so there was some kind of unification, and this unification was fostered by trade and craft. Here in Trussell, local craftsmen worked amber, made cones, swords, jewelry, tools, and weights. Slaves worked in production processes, and as labor in the port, the trading emporia stretched all along the Baltic coast from present-day Rostock to the Na River where St. Petersburg stands today. The Slavic peoples who inhabited this vast area lived in simple villages and used slash-and-burn agricultural techniques. They were easily dominated by the predatory Vikings. On the other hand, there is a widespread belief that the largest portion of goods exported from Eastern Europe to the Caspian Sea with the aid of the Scandinavians were slaves. It is even said that in the 10th century the Arabian slave markets were full of slaves from Eastern Europe. The Vikings turned their military outposts into market towns where traders paid them for protection. The Scandinavians forged new trade links between East and West in 841, while in France the Northmen were burning down Juan, a Scandinavian warrior. Rurik and his two brothers founded the kingdom of Novargi. They were invited by the Slavic tribes of present-day Russia to give them peace and protection. The finds here at Arovi Garish, just upstream from Novgorod, show a significant Scandinavian presence. The Viking artifacts that have been found in the Novgorod area are connected both to trade and warfare. We find not only weapons but also scales and silver in the Scandinavian grave, which suggests that the dead person was a trader. The impressive rivers and lakes of northern Russia were the heart of the early Viking conquests. Lake Ladoga is still a shipping thoroughfare, and the Vav River flows into it, rising at Lake Ilmen 200 km further south. The Svir River in northern Russia is one of the waterways that still today connects the Caspian and Baltic Seas. Weapons such as axes and swords from Novgorod and Staria Ladoga show that these were not only thriving trading centers but also military bases. We have to say that very few Scandinavian weapons have been found in the Novgorod area, while objects to do with trade and everyday life have been found in great quantities. We should also say that Russia is crossed by many rivers. Travel was by river mainly, and the Scandinavians were traders. 50 years after the first recorded raid against Lindis van, Vikings had penetrated the Eastern European river system as far as the Black Sea. Rory's successor Alec moved his headquarters down the Dnieper and seized the town of Kiev in 907. He captured Constantinople by dragging his ships around the sea defenses in 911. In the same year the Vikings gained Normandy as their new home in France. Alec struck a trade deal with the Byzantine Empire, turning Kiev into the capital city of a great ruling dynasty. Part of the deal was to provide mercenaries to the emperor as his own personal bodyguard, known as the Varangian Guard. By now half of England and much of France was ruled by the Vikings, but this was not the end of the Viking raids. Iceland sits halfway across the North Atlantic Ocean, the most dangerous sea for Vikings to cross, and yet by accident or by design Scandinavians landed here already in 840. Add later political upheaval at home led to an exodus of refugees who opposed the rule of Harald Music. Fairhair. The Vikings who left Norway for Iceland found a completely virgin land and brought their social structures with them. The owners of the largest farm were also the high priests of the community, and called Gothar. 40 Gothar held an all-thing or parliament here at the all-thing stone every year, here more than anywhere else. The early Viking way of life was preserved from here. The Viking ships plowed the seas westward to Greenland, where 2 settlements were established. From there they traveled as far as the American continent. For the first time around the year 1000 the travels to the land known as Vinland was recorded by a monk sailed with the explorer Elief Eriksson. The sagas tell us about the Viking trips to America. They are covered by the saga literature. We have to assume that there were many more voyages than described in the sagas. We have also found traces of Viking settlements in America, and there are also American Indian stories about these blue-eyed people that they met. The settlements on the American continent lasted only a few years, while the mini-ice age of the 13th century onwards led to the decline of the Greenland settlements too. In Europe the violent Viking Age was reaching its climax. In Europe, the Viking invaders struck fear even more than a century after the Great Raids. The first millennium ad was a time of widespread violence. In 2012, 18 skeletons were found in the grounds of St. John's College, Oxford. Scholars immediately associated the find with the 102 St. Brice's Day massacre, when the King of England ordered all of the DS in his kingdom murder. The task of identifying who these men were fell to Mark Pollitt of the Forensic Archaeology Department. We first radiocarbon dated a selection of them, and for various reasons the radiocarbon age wasn't exactly what we would have expected to be A02 ad, but there are reasons that might be the case, so we then began to look at the carbon and nitrogen isotones in the bone collagen, which is an indicator of diet and we also looked at the strontium and oxygenized stopes in the dental enamel from the teeth because that gives you some indication of where those individuals grew up. The skeletons from Oxford suffered a similar fate to another group found near the seaside town of Weymouth. Were they Vikings? Yeah, we matched them with the Vikings that had been recovered from where they're roughly contemporary from the radiocarbon dates, and other people had done strum and oxygen in their teeth, and they found the same pattern that we found, not from the south of England, and actually on the diagram they're moving in a direction which suggests both an older geology which is consistent with possibly Scandinavia and also a colder climate which is also consistent with Scandinavia, while strontium isotope techniques suggested the victims were not from the south of England, possibly from Danelaw. Therefore, other marks hinted at their true identity. Several of the skeletons showed healed wounds which may plausibly have come from blade wounds, and so I think in a group of 16 to 25-year-old males, if they're carrying healed blade wounds, then the chances are they've been in combat conflict before. So I think that they're not sort of a group of people who were farmers and just sort of happened to be passing by. I think they are either professionals, mercenaries, or raiders of some description. The beginning of the 11th century was a violent time, and national identities were less important than local and family ties. It's quite complicated to understand what identity would have meant at that time. I think we tend to use these titles of these are day and those are Anglo-Saxons, but all of this identity is a sort of a created identity, whether they are, when we say they're Danes, whether they're people who come from Denmark, or whether they might be second or third generation people born in Britain but of originally Danish stock and perhaps holding to Danish customs and practices, possibly dressing more like Danes than Anglo-Saxons. It's very difficult to know. Far to the north in York, another victim of murder was found buried under the Coppergate streets. This skeleton shows multiple blade wounds, but knowing why this young man died is almost impossible. Why was the person killed? Obviously we'll never know. It looks like it was violent and you can tell that through the osteology, but if you were to try and pinpoint me down to say why can we bring that to an event, I honestly can't say we can. But what we need to bear in mind is that what this person represents is a bloody and violent end to somebody's life, still in an era when a lot of this is going on. Although the legend of the violent Viking lives the true nature of their society may be different from what scholars have written for centuries, what archaeology is very good at is breaking down this idea that the Vikings are compartmentalized, the Anglo-Saxon world is compartmentalized, the PS and the Kells are compartmentalized, and actually we start to bring that bleeding of the edges together, and we start to see a lot more complex society, and where people can define themselves. People obviously go to war about definition and power, but at the same time we get that input of continental imported goods. We see goods from Britain going abroad, and it just brings together. I think we make it a rich tapestry. Perhaps the most daring of all raids left Sweden for the furthest eastern edge of the Viking world around 1040 at Ingvar the far-traveled, and a small army of 1,000 men left central Sweden for Russia and then on to present-day Georgia, then under Arab influence, where they won a decisive battle. The land ruled by Sarans was known as Cir land. They may have crossed the Caspian Sea and reached Tashkent, but only one of the many ships returned home. 26 runstones in Sweden commemorate the men who traveled with Ingvar, but most touching of all is this one now standing in the grounds of Grip's home castle on Lake Malin. It tells the tale of Ingvar's brother. Tlur had this stone raised in memory of her son Hera, Ingvar's brother. They traveled valiantly far for gold, and in the east gave food to the eagle. They died in the south, and Siren Enva may have been a royal blood, and his family were among the leaders of the international Viking elite who still led their warriors into battle 250 years after the raid on Lindisfarne. The most persistent myth about the Vikings is that they were thieves, they were pirates, they were great warriors, they always won all the battles, they were brave, they didn't fear death, and so on, but the truth is that they were /t better or worse than others at that time. They did live in a violent time. The year 1000 was a turning point in the story of the Vikings. The era of the early raids was over and Viking expansion had reached its high tide mark, but it was also the beginning of a century when even more bloodshed. The freebooting Viking chieftains faded away, and in their place great Viking lords, kings of whole countries who unleashed the power of Viking armies against England and against each other, spilt more blood than at any time in the preceding centuries. Rich professional mercenary forces dominated Eastern and Western Europe. Their leaders learned the craft of kingship from their enemies and built states that are still with us today. The Viking states grew out of the most extensive military expansion the world had ever seen since Roman times. Scandinavian warriors took their thirst for conquest from the heart of the Viking homeland to the very edges of Europe. Along the way they laid the foundations of states that are still with us today. Archaeologists from Moscow, Russia are washing out the remains of Viking Age tombs near Novgorod on the Great Volkhov River. Discoveries here and elsewhere in Europe are revealing an unknown quality of these Scandinavian adventurers. The merciless pagans built enduring kingdoms and empires all over Europe. So first they came here to build a state, then they saw that they had opportunities to become rich. Above all, they were adventurers, or people who made a living in this way, such as the clan of Rorik, who brought with them their own duina or band of warriors who were nothing more than hired mercenaries. What archaeology is very good at is breaking down this idea that the Vikings are compartmentalized. The Anglo-Saxon world is compartmentalized, the PS, and the Celts are compartmentalized, and actually we start to bring that bleeding of the edges together. The 8th of June 793 AD marks the opening of the Viking Age. A handful of pirates attacked the holy island of Lindisfarne and left within a few hours. 70 years later 4 Viking warriors landed with an army. Halland, Ivagwam and Yuba wrote their names in blood as in 865 their band of raiders known as the Great Heathen Army made its way to York in northern England. The city was one of 2 capitals of the deeply divided kingdom of Northumbria. The amazing Viking military machine swept away England's part-time armies and pillaged the countryside, mainly churches. One of the Viking leaders of the Great Heathen Army captured the capital of Maria here at Repton, central England, and made it into his base. A mass grave found here is dated to 873 AD by an English penny found among the skeletons spread around a central grave of a tall male warrior, possibly himself. Nearby, dozens of Viking tumuli found at Heathwood suggest that this was their military cemetery. In the same year, the followers of another of the Viking leaders, Halland, began farming the land of Northumbria to sustain themselves during the long winter. It was the beginning of the Scandinavian settlement of England. Over the next 2 centuries, huge sagas of the British Isles became part of a vast 6 Viking empire. The Vikings made York their capital in England. Peter Connolly is the lead archaeologist on the Hungate excavation site in modern-day York in England. Once the capital of a Viking kingdom, York is the dominant urban place in the north of England at that time, and has a population, for sake of argument, 10,000. So extrapolating out into that, when you start to talk about small farmsteads, and small village hamlets, communities, other small seaside towns, or on rivers, we're not talking a massive population, hundreds of thousands, say for the north of England into Scotland, but I'd be very surprised if anybody estimated, upwards of 1 million in England. Alfred, King of Wessex, was the last Saxon king to resist the Viking onslaught. His response was to reform his state. He set up a standing army and navy and fortified the towns of southern England. The increased efficiency of Alfred's Wessex not only stopped the Viking conquest but served as a model for the invaders too. The treaty between Alfred and the last surviving leader of the Great Heathen Army, Gam, left a large part of England under Viking control, an area that came to be known as Dam. But Gam became a Christian. Raiders from Ireland and Scandinavia continued to view York as the capital of a great Viking realm, but Alfred's successors repeatedly repulsed the attacks, and in 920 AD even the city of York recognized King Edward the Elder as the King of England. The Vikings raided Scotland too, capturing the castle at Donat on the east coast and Dumbarton on the river Clyde, mercilessly taking hundreds of slaves to Ireland. The new kingdom of Strath, now in the heart of Glasgow, grew out of the ashes of Dumbarton. Its religious centre was governed an early medieval religious site, and is within the kingdom of Strathclyde. There has been the movement of the royal power base from Dumbarton Rock, undoubtedly influenced by the Vikings themselves. And further up the Quay, over time the Northumbrian and Scottish Vikings were converted to Christianity, and the local and Scandinavian cultures merged. You have quite a complex kingdom set up with the PS and the Scots and the Gills and the Strathclyde and the Northumber and sort of Anglo-Saxon population as well, so you know you're getting quite a hot pot of different cultures coming through. The Hogsback tombs of G were the work of a school of sculptors, evidence of an efficient and prosperous new kingdom. There are obvious connections in the belief systems of the mixture of Strathclyde and Viking Age culture that you see on the west coast of Scotland, and you're seeing, say, on the east coast of England. Hogsback tombs in Gav and here in Bolton, North Yorkshire, represent typical Scandinavian louses with bears at either end. They show how the Viking teeths continued to be used well after the Scandinavian invaders had been converted to Christianity. Evidence of the dominant Scandinavian culture in York can be seen at the Yorick Centre, built to house the findings of the Coppergate excavation site. The comb was an ornament no Viking man would do without, and they were made here from deer antlers, while Viking jewelry and bronze works those Scandinavians added. The Vikings of York had a lot of fish and oysters, and this coolite fossilized feces tells us more about what they ate. Diet is very interesting because we have coprolite, which gives us some insight into the diet, and so fruit seeds surviving what we think of as plums and damson. There are huge amounts of animal bone thrown out into wasp pits, and we're talking about a high consumption of beef, to a lesser extent pig, but we get all the major domesticates. The Viking raids against the great empire of Charlemagne in 799 turned into invasions 40 years later, when his grandsons began a bloody civil war, leaving the empire's coastline undefended. An average Viking raid, of course, much depends on the period, but we're talking about several dozens of warriors, and the larger raids several hundred. That's the average. In 841, 13 ships sailed up the River Seine, and the Vikings burned Rouen, took the monks of Gier hostage, and in 845 even plundered Paris. In 885 thousands of Vikings besieged Paris again, and although the raiding forces were still unable to take on the might of the empire's armies, they used every opportunity to strike where the defenders were weakest. There were already interactions with the Frankish elites, so there was a range of relationships from political to trade understandings, and even at times alliances, because it happened that Frankish leaders asked the Scandinavians to work for them as mercenaries. In 911 the King of France Charles the Simple handed over to the Vikings the western seaboard of what is modern-day France in exchange for their protection against further raids. Their leader Ronlo became a Christian and gained the administrative tools to build a great music kingdom. One of the conditions was loyalty to the king and conversion, the baptism of the Scandinavian chiefs in Rollo's court, so that seems indispensable if they wanted to settle towns like Dieppe, whose name derives from deep, and Danish thrived with new trade routes to the north. The Vikings adopted the local language and merged with the local population, forging a new and powerful state. Even if peace had come to England and France, the politics of the rising kingdoms of Norway and Denmark continued to be played out on the English stage, and the Viking era was far from over. The rise of two aggressive and mutually hostile royal din is in Norway and Denmark heavily influenced events in modern-day France and England. In the 870s, King Harold Fair used his control of the strategic straits on Norway's western shoreline on Kamøy Island to build a new state, provoking an exodus of warriors forced into a life of a Viking, a word that came to mean adventurer. Marit Vea is the lead archaeologist at the Orala's excavation on Sea Island. The last battle was in Havord around year 870, and when Harold Fair won this battle he made Avalus into his most important royal estate, because this was where he could control the shipping traffic on the Norwegian coast. The best events in Norway impacted politics in England too. In 920 Harold Fairhair died, and his son Eric Bloods took his place, but he was defeated and exiled by his English-educated brother Harold the Good. The fragile peace that had settled on England, Norway, and Denmark was about to be shattered. In 847 the restless nobles of North Hraia and England invited the pagan exile Eric to rule over them. They elected him king here at Rheims Cathedral and began minting coins in his name. The Saxon reaction was devastating. King Edred had Ripon Cathedral burned to the ground, and the terrified Northumbrians withdrew their support of Eric, who was killed in battle after a second attempt to win the throne of York. As we shall see, his Danish wife and a brood of dispossessed children thirsted for vengeance. During these upheavals York continued to thrive, and Saxons and Scandinavians mostly lived in peace. The city of York grew, and the Scandinavian and Saxon populations merged in the most surprising way. Even building materials showed curious interaction between communities. The very first building that we excavated in Hungate, the preservation was very good. You think of these buildings as a big rectangular hole dug into the ground to stop those earth and sides Collapsing, you need to line them with wood and posts, and as our wood technology experts start to remove the boards or clean them up and look at them, he realized that they were all parts of the hull of a ship. These weren't boards from a Viking ship, they were actually from an Anglo-Saxon boat. The building techniques show how society changed over the decades after the fall of Eric Bialex, and a more peace period began when we start to see say the soon in future buildings develop in the latter half of the 10th century. They fit with the sequence of archaeology that we see in places like Oxford and London and Chester, and we're probably seeing a post-blood confirmation of a stronger Anglo-Saxon culture starting to move up through the country itself. The Danes in England continue to maintain a separate ethnic identity well into the 11th century, as we shall see. One especially violent incident in an already violent age precipitated a full-scale invasion by the Viking king of Denmark. In an early example of ethnic cleansing, King Ethelred ordered the murder of all Danes in England on St. Brice's Day. 102 possible evidence of this was found in St. John's College, Oxford, when a car park was being built behind new student accommodation. Mark Pollard is the forensic archaeologist appointed to examine the skeletons. The ditch was outside the city walls, so one assumes that the people were marched out. If they were in the city, were taken out and executed and then just pushed in the ditch. The most advanced scientific techniques were used to identify who they were and why they died. First, radiocarbon data selection of them. We then began to look at the carbon and nitrogen isotopes in the bone collagen, which is an indicator of diet. And we also looked at the strontium and oxygen isotopes in the dental enamel from the teeth, because that gives you some indication of where those individuals grew up. Dating the bodies was complicated by the probability that the victims had a high marine protein diet. If people have a large proportion of marine protein in the diet, then this can actually show up in the radiocarbon date as making it earlier than we would expect. So when we dated the St. John's College skeletons, we found that the radiocarbon ages were up to 100 years earlier than A2 However, strontium and oxygen isotope analysis of their tooth enamel gave some indication as to where they grew up. It's difficult to say where they did come from, but I think it's reasonably confidently we can say that they, when brought up in the south of England, were these Viking raiders or innocent Danish traders caught in the city on the day of collective Saxon paranoia. Could the skeletons found in St. John's College have been victims of the St. Brice's Day massacre, and how did their fate tie into the spread of a wider Scandinavian empire? For the St. John's skeletons, we don't think they came from the south of England. They have a young demography, 16 to 25 in general. They're all male, some of them are carrying healed battle wounds, so that to me suggests that what you've got is a raiding party. Whether or not these men were victims of the Saxon massacre, they represent a new and vital clue in showing the violent social tension that were rife in English society in the Viking Age. The St. Brice's Day massacre sent shock waves through Scandinavia. The new king of Denmark, Sven Forkbeard, attacked England with a mighty army. This was not a band of raiders. Sven's army was a formidable military machine. Shield wall clashed with shield wall in a war of conquest that left Sven king of England in 1014. His dominion stretched from Poland to England and Norway, and his son Canute inherited the first Viking empire. Sven Forkbeard's wife came from Poland, whose waterways were a vital part of the Viking trade network stretching to the Black Sea. Professor Chislow SCR believes all the evidence points to direct Viking control. It was very quick because it was a small group, about 500 people. They drove in here like a corporation, like the mafia, and they built their own place. Clues pointing to the origins of the Polish nation were found close to the river Vistula, one of the Viking thoroughfares from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Here at Bura, close to the Viking hub of VLC, a multi-ethnic cemetery seems to prove this was one of the centers of trade between East and West. Professor André Bker excavated the site. There were 4 objects of warriors' equipment in these graves, which we searched. They were characteristic because they related to different territories. In one grave we have a Vikings land sacks dated to the end of the 10th century and the beginning of the 11th, and what we excavated there was connected with the Scandinavian community and warriors from northern and western parts of Europe. Bojo was a truly cosmopolitan cemetery, showing how Viking society was based on trade as much as pillage. The fine Frankish amulet holder and Byzantine coins found alongside the central Scandinavian burials showed that many cultural influences were at play here. We found artifacts that come from northern, western, southern, and eastern Europe, so we can say that in one place we found objects from the whole of Europe that are concentrated in less than 50 square meters. When Sven Forkbeard chose the daughter of the first Polish king Meska as his wife, he was forging an alliance with one of the gatekeepers of the Eastern Plains. Chief Love SC believes Meska was a Viking. The important thing about the sister of Boris Chob, the daughter of Mesko the First Sava, was that she had a super career. She was the mother of Kings Canute and Harold. They say she was a Slavic woman, but she couldn't have been. She had to be from a Scandinavian family of very important clan. Yelling Central Denmark was the heart of Sven Forkbeard's Viking kingdom. This runestone was erected by Harald Bluetooth Sven's father, and commemorates the last pagan king of Denmark and founder of the dynasty that still reigns over the country today. King Harold bade these memorials to be made after Gore his father and Thea his mother, the Harold who won the whole of Denmark and Norway and turned the Danes to Christianity. Gorn the Old laid claim to the kingdom of Norway and controlled the southern coastline of Norway and Sweden. His daughter was married to Eric Blx, and when the Norwegian Viking was killed in England, she sent her children to fight their uncle on Karoe Island. Here on the Blood Heights they sailed past here over to AES, and met the then ruling king of Norway Hakon the Good in a bloody battle up on these old Bronze Age barrows on the Blood Heath. It was a bloody fight, and that is why it got its name, the Blood Heath. The blood was flowing here at the Blood Heights in view of Heron's court at Oral Nest. 3 of Eric's sons perished in battle against their uncle in 953, but Harkon was fatally wounded shortly afterwards, and 2 surviving nephews shared the throne. The wars between Viking warlords in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark sent shock waves throughout Western and Eastern Europe and consolidated the power of the great Viking monarchs. Modern archaeology throughout Europe is building a completely new picture of who the Vikings really were. Work carried out in laboratories as far away from each other as Novgorod, Nan, and Oxford show how a Scandinavian commonwealth stretched across Europe and generated great empires. One of the most lovely little beads that we recovered from Hungate small glass bead, highly decorated was made in the eastern Mediterranean probably made in Egypt turns up in I think first half of the 10th century. Context: it has come from the eastern Mediterranean all the way traded to a network, probably a very advanced network, as well to end up in Viking Jorvik. A snapshot of the Scandinavian empires of the mid-11th century shows the stunning success of Viking nation building. The Viking military machine was effective in conquest, but costly to build. Only the richest leaders could afford ships and soldiers to take abroad. On raiding expeditions, the return on investment had to be substantial for the raid or trading expedition to be worthwhile. The most profitable trade route was eastward. The shallow-keeled Viking ships sailed up the wide rivers that sliced through the Russian plains. Here slaves, furs, and amber were abundant. By 750 AD, the Scandinavians controlled the ancient Finnish and Slavic trading place at Staria Latiga, and in 841, the same year, Danes were attacking Paris. Other Vikings established their first kingdom here near Novgorod. Ruda is the curator of the museum exhibition here, which holds some of the most significant Viking artifacts in Russia. The written chronicles and archaeology tell us that this village was founded by Rorik I, one of the Scandinavian lords that were called Rus. He arrived in this area together with his Druzina, a band of Varangians. They had been invited by the elders of the Slavic clans who lived around Novgorod in order to create a power center, let's say to create a stronger administrative center. The Viking warriors pushed on up the river system and found a fortress on a bend in the river Dpa. It became a new capital city, Kiev. Only a few years later they were attacking Constantinople itself. Here the Vikings were known as Varangians or Rus. Adrian Saline is a researcher at St. Petersburg University and an expert on Viking Russia. I think that today the majority of researchers believe that the word Rus derives from the word Ri, rowers. Undoubtedly, when we refer back to ancient Russian traditions, the common name Rus with the small r referred not to a people but to a social group. The first chronicle of Viking Russia was written here in Kiev in the monastery of the caves by a Christian monk by the name of Nestor. His mummified body still lies exposed for all to see. His chronicle recounts the rise of the house of Rurik, and modern archaeology confirms that the first Russian state was Varangian or Viking. The excavations here in Rav Gadish have produced hundreds of Scandinavian artifacts that confirm the story told by Nestor in his first chronicle of Russian history. The blue bead of a Viking woman's necklace is a common find here, showing that for centuries this remained a Scandinavian outpost. One particularly important artifact is this sword, one of the few Branded swords made in Europe. It was an extremely valuable object. Music. The sword in our collection is interesting mainly because of where it comes from and its shape. It is broken and bent. It comes from a Scandinavian grave. The sword was made in Western Europe, which is clear from the brand of a famous swordsmith of the Rhine Valley. Engraved on the blade Albert, who made many swords for export, and many made their way to the East. On the other hand, there is a theory whereby a large portion of the goods exported from Eastern Europe to the Caspian Sea by Scandinavians were slaves. It is said that the Arabs' slave markets in the 10th century were full of slaves from Eastern Europe. Ruri's successor Alec, who governed the kingdom as regent during the infancy of Ric's son Igor, is buried in this mound at Staria Ladaga in 907. Alec led an army of Rus to attack Constantinople and captured the city by carrying the light ships around the sea defenses. The trade agreement they extracted legitimized the line of Ruk as kings of Kiev and Novgorod. Every year great convoys of Viking ships descended the river Dnieper, hauled their goods overland around the great rapids on the waterway and gathered here at Han on the Black Sea, still a busy port today, to carry their wares to the imperial capital. However, we don't see permanent conflict in the 9th and 10th centuries, probably because the population in some areas were slaves and in others Finns, and the Scandinavians occupied certain market niches. There is no indication of trade of furs for silver outside Scandinavian music. Culture. The great Muslim empire of Baghdad also traded with Russian Vikings and suffered their attacks. Ahmad al-Fathan, writing in the early 10th century, describes the Vikings as still barbaric by the civilized standards of the Arabs. They were covered in tattoos, washed once a week, and held bizarre pagan rites and elaborate funerals that included human sacrifice and ship burnings. The descendants of Ruk continued to rule in Kiev until his grandson Svetoslav was killed by roving Ag warriors during a trade expedition. The kingdom was plunged into civil war. Vladimir, his natural son, defeated the legitimate heirs and became king, and in 988 converted to Christianity, and married the sister of the Byzantine emperor, further legitimizing the house of Rorich as rulers by God's will. Vladimir and his successor Yaroslav continued to foster their bonds with Scandinavia and drew on the Viking homeland for warriors and goods to trade along the rivers of a vast Viking empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Caspian Sea. The final drama of the Viking epic played out along the waterways of northern and eastern Europe. The story takes us back to the frozen north, where the sons of Eric Bielix ruled after a long drawn-out civil war with their uncle. The kingdoms of the Scandinavian north and east suffered years of civil war that threw up some of the greatest leaders of the whole Viking music. Epic legend has it that Astur, daughter-in-law of Harald Fair, fled from the Ra of the sons of Eric Bielix with her 3-year-old son Olaf Trivas to join her brother in Kiev, but fell prey to pirates, and little Olaf was made a slave. 6 years later he was freed by his uncle, who raised him in Novgorod. He served King Vladimir as a soldier but gained most of his prestige and wealth as a mercenary, fighting for the Holy Roman Empire against the Danish King Harald Bluetooth and his puppet king of Norway. The mercenary Olaf also married a Polish princess who died young, and after years of raiding Scotland and Ireland and a second marriage to an Irish queen, Olaf was converted to Christianity. He returned to Norway and won back his rightful place on the throne as a direct descendant of Harald Fairhair. He forcibly converted Norway to Christianity and ruled from 997 for 3 years until defeated and killed in a naval battle against an alliance of his old enemies in an expedition to present-day Poland. His life is marked by legendary events. Olaf Trivas had to battle with heathen powers here at Avila several times. He was here with his men, I think there were of them, and then a ship came into Arles with seers and other sorcerers, and they came to curse the king. They threw out a magical black mist. Olaf Tayson was saved by his Christian beliefs, and the black cloud was thrown back at the seers. However, his reaction was less than forgiving, and this is the way that they died. They were to be put out at the Skretcher Rock, and when the sea got higher the sorcerers drowned, and it was a slow death. Of course, the sworn enemy of Olaf was the aggressive Harald Bluetooth, forced to convert to Christianity on his defeat by the German emperors. In the early Viking Age, kings in Denmark wielded far less power than in the Christian empires and kingdoms where the church provided key administrative services. Tom Christensen has excavated the ancient Danish chieftains' camp at Ly for the past 20 years. It is not that the Danes turned their backs on Europe, but they were a Germanic tribal society which had its traditions and were tied to them. I think that the power was divided between clan chiefs. There might have been a sort of king, but not an autocratic king, as power was mainly based on alliances between the various clans. These enormous mounds at Yelling are at the center of the largest ship setting in Scandinavia and must have represented an important pagan shrine. Evidence that Harold actually did control the whole of Denmark are these fortresses called Trelleborgs spread around his realm that stretched into modern-day Sweden. Each fort was circular with 4 doors and long houses in each quarter. Although Bluetooth was nominally Christian here in Traer, the remains of 2 children thrown into a well at the age of 4 show that human sacrifice continued far into his reign. Harold Bluetooth claimed the thrones of Norway and even Sweden and drew on the services of the finest pagan mercenary force of the time, the Jan Vikings, one of whom is commemorated on this runestone on the Swedish island of Öland based in present-day Valen. They remained Bluetooth's allies till the end, well after he was deposed by his own son Sven Forkbeard in 998. He is buried in Resilda, the first Christian parish in Denmark. The first Danish bishop was an Englishman, but the Germans wanted Denmark as a church province, so when Adam of Bremen later on wrote about the conditions in Denmark, he portrayed Harold Bluetooth as a positive leader for the Germans and stated that his burial took place in Rost. The Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian kings looked eastwards to the great plains of Poland and Russia for their wealth, and sent men and goods down the great rivers to Constantinople, where they traded with the great empire and served as mercenaries in the imperial Varangian Guard. Nearly 3 centuries after the first recorded Viking raid in England, the epic of the Northmen reached its climax. This runestone in the Checkhart of Tumbo, Sweden, commemorates a Viking warrior who died in the service of the Greek emperor. Another near Ubala commemorates a great captain. Across Scandinavia, memorial stones like this bear testament to Viking soldiers who fought in the Mediterranean. The elite Varangian Guard fought along the empire's frontiers and in Italy clashed with descendants of other Northmen who had built a home in France. The Palace of the Normans in Pomo is a monument to the audacious Norman mercenaries who became kings of southern Italy. 2 brothers from Normandy, descendants of the Viking invaders, came with their men to fight the Greeks in 1014. And stayed. They emerged the final victors after a series of long drawn-out wars in southern Italy. In the early 11th century, Count Robert of Hauteville finally pushed out the Arabs from Sicily to become king. He was crowned here in the Palace of the Normans by the powerful Bishop of Pomo. The Norman rule over Sicily was famous for its tolerance and openness to trade with the Arab world. Even farther east in the bustling metropolis of Constantinople, a Norwegian mercenary commanded the imperial guard known as the Varangian Guard. Harald Hardrada was an heir to the Norwegian throne but working for hire in Constantinople. With regards to Harald Hardrada's trips to Constantinople and to Africa, which are also recorded in the sagas as well as in international contemporary sources, we find small traces of the Vikings. For example, in Constantinople, where a Viking has written graffiti in a beautiful church in 1046, Harald had turned his sights back to the homeland of Norway, where his nephew Magnus the Good had been elected king. Following the Viking river passages through Russia and up across the Baltic, had made his way back to Scandinavia, where he attacked Denmark and cut a deal with Magnus to rule jointly. When Magnus died, Harald became the sole King. Harold's reign in Norway and Denmark was one of peace and prosperity, with the emergence of churches, towns, and driving trade and minted money. Hardrada's ambition was to recreate Ken's North Atlantic Empire. He claimed the Danish throne and then was invited by the exiled half-brother of the English king to take the English throne as well. In 1066, Harold set Sala from Norway. Other powerful kings had their eyes on the English throne, and Normandy William had been promised the throne and now was preparing to take it by force. In William's view, King Harold Godwinson of England was a usurper. The Bayeux Tapestry supports William's claim to the English throne and describes how he went about winning it for himself. The Duke of Normandy could count on important allies in his bid. On the 12th of August, 1066, William's fleet sailed up the coast of France and stopped in the ports of Normandy as it collected soldiers from the Viking settlements. The Norman armada landed at Pavie on the 28th of September and made its way to Hastings as William and Harold had bore down toward England. The English King Harold Godwinson rushed north with his army. Harold had defeated the English at Ford on the outskirts of York, but when the might of the English army met the Viking hordes at Stamford Bridge, Harold was killed in battle. The exhausted English army marched south again to face William of Normandy at Hastings. Just 19 days later, the Norman cavalry fled in front of the Saxon Shield War, and William was given up for dead. The Saxons broke ranks to pursue the Normans, but when William showed his face to his men, the Normans rallied and Harold was killed. William was crowned King of England on Christmas Day 1066. William, a descendant of the Northmen, was now King of England. land Viking kingdoms would flourish, stabilize, and become Christian in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, southern Italy, England, Scotland, and Ireland, but the largest kingdoms took root in the far-flung steppes and forests of Poland and Russia, where Ray's descendants ruled for another 400 years. They sold furs and slaves down the great rivers of Eastern Europe to Constantinople and Baghdad. They brought back silk, spices, and silver, which they hoarded in treasure troves in their homeland. They captured the world's largest city and founded the first Russian states. They were the Varangians, the Rus, the Vikings. Music. Istanbul, Turkey, once Constantinople, the greatest city of the ancient world, heart of a 1,000-year-old empire to the Vikings, and still today it is the gateway to the east. First the Scandinavian warriors came here to plunder, then in a daring raid they penetrated its massive defenses and extracted a privileged trade deal. Today it is believed, as far as I know, that the appearance of the Vikings here in Eastern Europe in the 9th century is closely connected with their desire for silver. Obviously, the Eastern world was most interested in slaves and furs. The Vikings had plundered the vast plains of Central Europe for centuries before they pushed up the river systems to the Black Sea and attacked Constantinople. Dozens of runestones like these in modern-day Sweden tell us of the fearless Scandinavian warriors who died in faraway Greece and Turkey. Runestone sagas and the first Russian chronicle tell us the story of the Vikings of Eastern Europe, but before anything was written, Vikings were plundering the shoreline of the Baltic Sea. Two amazing Viking ships found on the Estonian island of Serer and excavated in 2011 prove that the Vikings were here far earlier than ever recorded. When your repeats of the history faculty of Tallinn sent bones and organic artifacts for radiocarbon dating, the results were stunning. Analysis of the items we found show that they can be dated to pre-Ing times. The warriors who died here were a class of professional fighters, or Vikings as they are known today. At first we weren't quite sure where these men came from. Judging from some of the items and other marks, it was more or less clear we were dealing with Scandinavian sailors. Two sites in Poland also prove that the Vikings colonized the esters of the great rivers of Central Europe to control access to the plains of modern-day Russia, Poland, and Ukraine, rich in furs and slaves. Mick Yagodinsky has excavated the site of Truson near Along. For the past 20 years the finds here show a vibrant industrial town dominated by a Viking military elite, a base for the trafficking of people and goods all the way to the Black Sea. Music. First of all, what we found was that the size of the settlement was about 20 hectares with regular buildings. The division of the harbor area from the center area and evidence of crafts and trade activity around the harbor. On the western edge of today's Poland, near the ester of the Oder River, lies Volyn, another Viking trading post where local Baltic populations mixed with the Viking traders. Vek Filipak heads the excavations. Here written sources tell us that people of many ethnic origins settled here in Wallen. Know about Saxons, but we can't find any archaeological traces of them, and the Rus also. And we know that Arabs came here because of the amber and other objects of music trade. Every year hundreds of modern-day Vikings come here to participate in mock battles and live the life of the Scandinavian raiders. The Oder was one of their entry points to the great Central European plains. The rivers that flow into the Baltic Sea were the thoroughfares for trade with the south. Far to the east lay the most profitable route of them all, Lake Ladoga, Europe's largest lake and Russia's northernmost expanse of fresh water. One of its tributaries is the great river Valov, the waterway leading to the industrial complexes of Valov City and Kirishi. For thousands of years this lake and river system was the gateway to the depths of the Russian steppe and beyond it to the civilizations of the eastern Mediterranean. For the Vikings it was just one of the entry points in their aggressive penetration of the Eastern European land mass. A few kilometers south of the Valov estuary into Lake Ladoga lies Staria Loga. Here archaeological excavations have exposed the birthplace of Russia. The typical runic inscriptions and Scandinavian amulets that date back to 753 show that the Vikings had come to dominate this strategic point on the river almost half a century before the first recorded raids against Western Europe. This is Stara, where for certain we have found Scandinavian artifacts dating to before the Viking Age. This is the story of how the great Eastern Empire of the Vikings developed out of a small band of ruthless pagan traders and warriors drawn to the incredible riches of the Eastern Mediterranean. It starts here in Staria Ladoga, an ancient trading place on the Valov River in northern Russia. Some of the most important artifacts relating to the Vikings go back to ancient times, mainly the 9th and 10th Centuries their ships plowed the seas and rivers of the north and penetrated into the land mass of today's Russian Ukraine and Poland in search of the legendary wealth of the south. Here they captured slaves, plundered furs, and took them to the cities of Baghdad and Constantinople, where they exchanged them for silver coins, some of which found their way back to the Viking homeland today. As far as I know, most researchers believe that the Scandinavians exported silver from the Caspian Sea and imported furs taken from Eastern Europe, but here there is some divergence in opinion on the origins of certain goods. Furs were objects of prestige, not very practical, but of prestige. The Vikings, or Varangians as they were known here, founded an enduring empire based on the immense wealth gained from trafficking precious goods and slaves with the great empires of Byzantium and Baghdad. Early in the 8th century the Vikings conquered trading places along the rivers of Russia 100 kilometers south of Staria Latiga. Archaeology students from Moscow are washing mud from Viking Age graves at Ravagadish on the banks of the Vav River opposite the city of Novgorod, Russia's first capital. They find a blue bead which once belonged to a Viking woman's necklace. The day before they found an axe head, confirming that these tombs were the final resting place of the earliest Viking warriors who came to dominate the area. The finds from this site are sent to the museum's restoration laboratories. Here a laboratory technician is cleaning and preserving wooden objects from the many sites around the city of Novgorod. The wood is preserved using glycol that replaces water in the wood cells. The excess is frozen dry. Alizia Ruud is the curator of Novgorod's Viking exhibition and has been following the results of the Rakova Gadish excavations for years. According to the chronicles confirmed by archaeological finds, this village was founded by one of the Scandinavian princes, Rus as they were called, Prince Rorik. He came here in our lands with his Dina or band of Varangians. The arrival of the Vikings or Varangians is dated to approximately 840. The Finnish name for them was Ari, corrupted to the word Raus. The name the new military elite came to be known by for centuries. There are no finds that directly refer to Rorik. However, we have found artifacts dating back to the early Middle Ages, the 9th century, that are connected to Scandinavian culture, and were found at Arovi Gadish. Today we link the word Rus with the Finnish word Rui. There is no doubt about that. However, in ancient Rus tradition it is possible that the word Rus referred initially not to a country or a people but to a social group. The dynasty of Rurik ruled Russia for hundreds of years. Chapters of history told here on this monument in Novgorod. His son Ingvar or Igor was a child when he died, and our faithful companion Aik reigned until he came of age. Polish professor Czesław Scr has passionately studied the Viking kingdoms of Europe, and Ingvar was raised by Oleg, the leading noble. He had a catastrophe on his hands. Ruri had allowed friendly Scandinavians to sail down the Nir and set up a new settlement. There were Isolde and Dir. The city of Kiev stands on a bend in the river Dir. Ruri's followers Isolde and Dir captured the town and turned it into their base for a new push down the river system towards the Black Sea. In 860, the city of Constantinople witnessed the arrival of a flotilla of Viking ships. The emperor was away fighting the Arabs, and the Vikings, although dissuaded from attacking the city by its massive walls, attacked the coastline. Instead, the city's religious leaders had taken refuge on the so-called Prince's Islands, which the Vikings mercilessly pillaged. For the first time, the Vikings contemplated the wealth of the imperial capital with their own eyes. They would come back for more. Oel was angry that Isolde and Dir had gained such power that they wanted to be ys, or even more. They had power because when they were in KV they attacked Byzantium, the greatest power in the world at the time. They were so brave that they pillaged Constantinople, so it's historical fact that Oleg murdered Isolde and Dir. Alak captured Kiev and murdered Isolde and Dir, whose tombs lie under this church on the riverbank outside the city. Next he moved on Constantinople, known to the Vikings as Mikkel Garda. In 907 once again the Viking fleet appeared on the Bosphorus, sacking coastal villages and Christian monasteries. In a famous surprise attack, Alec had wheels put on his ships, carried them across land, crossed the Golden Horn and entered the city. Unable to hold the prize of all prizes, Alec the pagan settled for a privileged trade agreement and strategic alliance with the imperial city, the heart of the Christian world, which turned the kingdom of Kiev and Novgorod into the most powerful state in Eastern Europe, which also supplied mercenaries for the emperor's bodyguard. It was a lucrative business, as the Varangian guardsmen were paid 40 gold pieces a year plus food, lodging and special bonuses. The golden era of the Vikings in the east was about to begin. The sun rises on the Viking mounds of Staria Latiga. This burial mound once held the remains of Rurik's successor Alak, whose attack on Constantinople is the high point of the Viking Eastern saga, thrusting these fearless barbarians into the history books of the great city. The primary source of our knowledge of the Viking origins of Russia is the chronicle written by a Christian Orthodox monk called Nestor, who is buried here in Kiev in the monastery of the caves, the very first built on the river Dear. Nestor recounts the development of the first Russian state, but makes no mention of what happened to Isolde and Dear's followers. According to Chiselev Scr, they fled westwards to modern-day Poland. There was no military opposition here. The population was Pentry and cowed. There was no one to stop them. To the north was the Baltic Sea with access via Wallen-Kabra-Troso, and along there were the swamps of Nok, so they had security. On the west, I mean protection from Kiev and Novgorod. There were swamps of the Pos, and to the east the slaves of the El and Al. However, when we talk of Scandinavians who settled in the land of future ancient Russia, I don't think we can talk of great global migration of peoples who moved freely between Normandy and York, for example, and Iceland and Kiev. The rise of Poland as a place of passage of the cosmopolitan Viking elites of the time is highlighted by the remarkable archaeological find at Buren near the Vistula River. Andrei Bio excavated the site that turns Polish history on its head. This is a completely untraditional cemetery because there's nothing like this cemetery in the whole of Europe. Every grave is rich, there is no poor grave. It's a cemetery for the social elite. The archaeologists excavating Bura found a number of graves from different epochs and different cultures. The multi-ethnic community controlled a key point on the river Vistula. Let's take Badger. There we have traders. We find equipment that shows that these people engaged in trade. There were also warriors with their families, people who control this thoroughfare. The thoroughfare of the Vistula is very important because it connects the North Sea, Baltic Sea via the Vistula via the river Buk to the Black Sea and Byzantium, so controlling this route was the best way to become rich. The central figure was a young male warrior killed in battle, his jaw hacked off. He was buried with 2 women, possibly slaves, and with his weapons and armor. Professor Bio called in experts in strontium isotopes and DNA to identify where the skeletons came. Music from the northern and central Vistula are very important. We have found many graves or cemeteries along this river that have produced Scandinavian artifacts. In most of them we have only these artifacts to prove the connection, while in Boder we also did strom isotope and DNA analysis proving that these were indeed foreigners. The coins from Germany and England found in the graves are key in dating the cemetery to the late 10th and early 11th century, the period of the hour of the very first Polish kingdom founded by King Meska of the past dynasty in Poland. The Viking remains seem to indicate that Scandinavians had more influence on local politics than was thought before. In my opinion, Vikings, I mean Vikings from Kiev Rus, the ones who built Viking Russia, came down the Vistula and Buk to Mazo and Vapila where Poland began. We owe them the origins of the Polish nation. I don't mean they built it, but they sparked it off. Their impact was key. They brought the know-how and sowed the seed of our country in these territories. In the 10th century, the tribe of the Poles which inhabited central Poland began expanding at the expense of other Slavic groups. The dynasty of the past, say Polish sources, began with a simple trader, but the first King Meska, a pagan, united all the slaves of central Poland under his rule. However, his daughter married the Danish Viking king Sven Forkbeard and his granddaughter Zat, son of Voldemar or Vladimir of Kiev. Understanding this coincidence is at the heart of the debate about Viking influence in the founding of Poland. We find more and more sites. For example, Boder for me, Swell was buried in Boder. Russian Swell, who was married with the daughter of Bischab. I'm sure that the objects which were found there, and the way the grave was organized, show that it was a Scandinavian Norman burial. With a little influence of the West, we gain more information by analysis of other Finns. He had a warrior's belt, and at the end of it was the so-called bent with a cross. The bent is the sign of Ruri's line, and the cross means that there was some connection with Zap, called Cursed, who was the son-in-law of our king Bisav. The movement of peoples up and down the rivers of Central and Eastern Europe proves that the Vikings were not constantly at war with their neighbors and may even have provided just the military element of this multicultural society. We made several interesting discoveries which show that people from these territories had contacts with steppe peoples, mainly the Khazars. In the second and third rows we find burial chambers with characteristic niches. They are not regular as in the first row, but they have this kind of niche. These graves with niches are characteristic of the steppe people. Very often we find this kind of grave in Khazar culture. Key artifacts of the excavation at Troso are exhibited in the small museum in Elon. The scales are particularly significant as the Vikings valued their goods in weights of hacked silver coins. Jewels or other objects that could be remelted into ingots. Combs were a favorite Scandinavian ornament, and women wore necklaces made from glass beads imported from Constantinople. Other artifacts that confirmed the prevalent Scandinavian culture in Trousseau were the amulets, especially this Valkyra, protector of Viking warriors. Amber was in the third place of the most desired things just after slaves and swords, so amber was very popular in that time. Amber was exported in trade networks which Vikings created. In the Baltic Sea, amber was abundant along these shores, and there was a strong market in the south for this precious resin. It was worked and made into jewelry here. However, there was an even richer item to trade: the river systems of Russia and Poland sliced through land inhabited by Slavic peoples. The Rus of K Vikings plundered the land for slaves and sold them to the great empires of the south and west. These were the single most profitable trade, and one witnessed by many a chronicler, a written source from Ibrahim Ibn Yaqub. He was a Spanish traveler from Seville. He mentioned that Varangians Normans came to Prague with slaves, or were they from Kavi and Kav. It is even said that in the 10th century Arab slave markets were full of slaves from Eastern Europe. Several million dirhams were exported from the Caspian Sea towards Europe's slaves, furs, amber, and whereas ivory flowed into the markets of the Mediterranean and Central Europe down the rivers of Russia and Poland. The kings in Kiev had almost exclusive access to the richest cities in the world. The Kiev Vikings, known here as Rus, raided and traded down this river, whose dangerous rapids earned a fearsome reputation. They were navigable only with the high water in the summer months. Cargo had to be carried around them, making traders vulnerable to attack from fierce nomadic tribes such as the Kazas-Burger and Patnik. As far as I know today, we do not believe there was a great difference between merchants and warriors in Scandinavian music culture. We can only say that in the 10th century, when there was almost no centralized power in most of the land, it was impossible not to be a warrior. Often in the Scandinavian graves we find, for example, not only weapons but also scales and some silver to allow this person to be a trader, so it's hard to say whether they should be defined as simply Scandinavians or Vikings. In the space of 20 years the Viking warriors and traders had penetrated deep into the Russian plains and forests, building camps and trading posts along the rivers, and reached the Black Sea. After they struck a trade deal with Constantinople, they gathered yearly convoys of ships here at Khan, still a thriving Black Sea port, and sailed to the great city. None of this would have been possible without the Viking ships such as the ones uncovered on Sima Island. They were light, shallow-keeled, and fast, good for attack and for trade. Yenby is the curator of the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, and the foremost expert on Viking ships. The Viking ships gave the Scandinavians a mobility that was unique at the music time. The fact that the ships were built so light, that they were so fast and so seaworthy, made it possible to conduct a type of warfare that was very difficult for the European kingdoms to handle. Modern replicas suggest Viking ships could reach top speeds of 20 to 25 knots, though on longer trips it is expected they moved more slowly at about the 3 to 6 knot range. The Vikings built many kinds of ship, both for war and for transport. Having said that, there are also many myths about the Viking ships and their use, and one of the hardest myths to defeat is that the Vikings traveled with their ships up the Russian rivers all the way down to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. We have no evidence that this happened. On the other hand, we do have historical and archaeological evidence that they used to change their means of transport underway into something suitable for the area and landscape that they were traveling through. The great trade expeditions from Kiev to Han and beyond involved a complex network of bases. With high water the ships could withstand the rapids, while with low water the traders carried their goods on horses and reloaded boats downstream for their onward transport to Han, where seagoing ships would await them for the journey to Constantinople. Norman are first once they arrived at the water systems leading down to the Black Sea or the Caspian Sea, then they would start sailing again, and we have a fantastic Byzantine source that describes how the Scandinavians did music. This AL's successor Ir, or Ingvar Rurik's son, led unsuccessful attacks against Banum and the Arab Empire and was killed on a punitive raid. His son Estislav made an alliance with Constantinople and succeeded in destroying the Khazar Empire. He too was killed during a trade expedition by Nek nomads during a land portage around the Dnieper Rapids. All the gains that Ruy's descendants had made over the century were squandered in a devastating civil war that brought about a radical change in the nature of the Viking Russian state. This did not stop them trading up and down the rivers of Russia, however, where the Arab diplomat En al-Fatlan found them on the Volga River. He described the bizarre pagan funeral rites of Viking warriors, which included the sacrifice of slave girls. The men he described were still very barbaric. According to Arab standards, they were tattooed from head to toe and rarely took baths. The civil war between Rik's offspring Left Vailmar or Vladimir as sole ruler, he expanded the kingdom of Novgorod and Kiev into Poland and eastwards and boldly demanded the hand of Princess Anna, sister of the Emperor of Constantinople, in exchange for his military support in quelling a rebellion. Vladimir chose to become an Orthodox Christian after famously considering all the monotheistic religions of the time, and seems to have embraced slaves in his court. Vladimir's illegitimate son Zapal married into the Polish royal dynasty when he was exiled from Kiev on the succession of Yaroslav the Wise, maybe the greatest Viking king of Russia. The fates of the royal dynasties of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden passed through the plains of Russia and Poland slowly over time, although the first Christian Viking king of Russia, Vladimir, and his successors continued to draw on Scandinavia for military manpower. The cities became more multicultural, however. We don't see permanent conflict in the 9th and 10th century. It is probable that the local population was Slavic in certain, Are and Finnish in others, and the Scandinavians occupied certain niches. There is no indication that the traffic and trade of silver and furs occurred outside Scandinavian music culture. Later, the Vikings and the Scandinavians were assimilated into the local population, so as time goes by, their influence becomes imperceptible. They become the local population as much as the slaves. They get married and have children and are no longer distinguished from the local population. This also involves the ruling class at Rov Gadish, where we find artifacts dating to as late as the 15th century. However, Scandinavian remains go back to the 11th century at the latest. The goods bought in these and other territories found their way to the great Scandinavian market towns of Tseng near Oslo in Norway, Hadab in Denmark, and Birka in Sweden. Here in Tseng, the archaeological remains show a flourishing trade between the farthest northern seas and the two capitals of the Mediterranean world, Baghdad and Constantinople. In 2004, the shores of what was once Constantinople revealed a whole port with sunken ships of the time the Vikings were trading there. The goods brought back from the Greek world were not only silver but also silk, fine beads, and jewels. The flat-bottomed Viking ships would have been docked alongside these typical Mediterranean craft as traders mingled in the markets of the empire's capital before the Scandinavians undertook the long and perilous journey northwards. As the market towns grew, so did the wealth of the chieftains who controlled them. They enhanced profit through trade by the exertion of military might. Striking local alliances were necessary, even through marriage, to ensure the flow of goods to their own markets. In some cases, we know that objects which were not typical of Slavic culture were produced here, so we know that glass beads or some kind of decoration on the monuments were probably 100% produced in this place. Volin is believed to have been the base of the so-called Jomsborg Vikings, and was one of the richest towns in the Scandinavian sphere of interest, although firmly in the Slavonic ethnic area. We must think about this as whole. The written sources say that Ibra was a huge city on the South Baltic coastline, and they tell us about events in this place at that time. So when we discover archaeologically this kind of big city dating back to medieval times, and we find lots of artifacts for trade and export and crafts and so forth, we have no doubts that this is that place. This runestone that stands on Åland commemorates the greatest battle of the Jomsborg Vikings, when their commander attempted to win the throne of Sweden on the plain of Ups. It invokes Odin and his daughter, a rare mention of pagan gods on a runestone according to the ancient sagas, written down centuries after the events by Icelandic scribes. The Jomsborg Vikings were mercenaries who often fought as allies of the Danish King Harald. Bluetooth. Some may well have also been of Slavic origin. Fighting for a king for plunder and for money was an honorable activity, and for hundreds of Viking men fortunes were to be made and lost in the plains of Poland and Russia. Their political influence on Slavic tribes, however, is the subject of heated debate. We have two periods in which Scandinavians come to Polish territories. In the late 9th century and early 10th, they were settlers, people who live in houses as part of a local community, and here we find equipment which is typical for people who do not take part in wars. They haven't got swords, but if we talk about the second part of the 10th century and beginning of the 11th, when the Vikings moved and developed as a group, we do find swords in graves, although Moravian influences in building the Polish state were also Strong King Meska I of Poland married his daughter to the Danish King Zane Forkbeard to ensure that the Scandinavians continued to exert their power in this area, possibly to counter the spread of the Germanic Empire eastwards through his marriage to the Polish princess Sven. Forkbeard's empire stretched from Poland to the British Isles, and the taxes he could raise from trade along the whole Baltic coastline turned him into the most powerful Viking king. However, he was not the only Viking monarch whose fortune was tied to the east. Olaf Trason worked as a mercenary for Vladimir before leaving Russia for the north, where he eventually married an Irish queen and became the first Christian king of Norway, and died fighting his Danish rival in the year 1000. But the greatest Viking of them all was the commander of the Imperial Varangian Guard Harald Hardrada. He made a fortune as a mercenary, but never forgot his descent from the Norwegian royal line. As commander of the Varangian Guard, Harald had played a key role in the politics of the great empire and learned how to rule as a Christian king from the most powerful emperors of the time. In 1040 he left the imperial court for the north and traveled the rivers of Russia back to his homeland in Norway, conquering the throne there before attacking England. It was the year 1066 and the sun was setting on the Viking era. The valiant Viking won the first battle against the Saxon king here at Ford near York, but died a heroic death in the Battle of Stamford Bridge, now a quiet Yorkshire village famous only for the last victory of the Anglo-Saxons, or during the Scandinavian transition to the Middle Ages. At the end of the Viking Age, we also see that the ship becomes a measure for various things. There are examples of tax systems based on land being divided into ships' crews. It sort of becomes a metaphor for society. Harald left behind him hundreds of Scandinavian Varangians who still spoke and wrote in the Nordic language. The palace at Constantinople overlooked the straits between Europe and Asia, and so occupied perhaps the most strategic place in the ancient world, close by the great church of Justinian. The Hagia Sophia was the largest church in the Christian world. Inside, in one of the top galleries, a Varangian guardsman left his mark in runic writing. His name Hallen is clearly visible, but the Hagia Sophia is not the only popular tourist spot today where one can find runic inscriptions where they are least expected. Here at the Aral in Venice stand two famous lion statues which once gathered the harbor. In Peru's the port of Athens, the carvings tell of Horsi, a good warrior cut down in battle after winning much gold. This runestone is in the churchyard in Tumbo, Sweden. It commemorates a Scandinavian warrior who died in the service of the emperor. The Greece runestones are the most common among these commemorative monuments in Sweden. Ingma the Far-Traveled was the most famous freebooting Viking of the East. He served at the court of Yaroslav and then as a mercenary for the Byzantine Empire, winning a famous battle at Sasti in Georgia that the Vikings called Sörland, the land of the Sarens. Only one of the many ships that sailed with him from Sweden returned, and 26 runestones commemorate men who died in the expedition. Tala had this stone raised in memory of her son Harald, Ingvar's brother. They traveled valiantly far for gold, and in the east gave food to the eagle, and died in the south in King Harald was Ingvar's brother and left from Sweden to make his fortune. He found his death instead at the end of the 11th century. The Scandinavian states became Christian. Trade became more peaceful. The empty space of Europe filled up with new states and opportunities for pillage, but disappeared. The last great tragic massacre of the Varangian god at Mekar by the Turks marked the beginning of the end of the Byzantine Empire. The ethnic origins of the first kings of Poland and Russia remain a mystery if we consider that the very description of a Viking is still shrouded in uncertainty. Scandinavian warriors colonized, plundered, traded, and had families throughout the central and eastern plains of Europe. Their DNA eventually mingled with the local populations and they adopted the local languages, but their contribution to building these new states is recorded forever in the chronicles or carved on stone, and it lurks at the very roots of Russian and Polish history.